The checking account said $156. 11 days until rent was due. Diane Holloway had done the math 3 times that evening, the same way she always did when the numbers were bad, slowly, carefully, like checking them again might change something. It never did. She closed the banking app and set her phone face down on the kitchen counter. The refrigerator held half a dozen eggs, a jar of peanut butter, and a carton of orange juice. She'd been rationing since Tuesday. The kind of inventory you don't write down, because writing it down makes it too real. Her son Marcus was 8 years old and asleep in the back bedroom, one thin wall away from the November rain that had been falling on South Memphis since late afternoon. Not a dramatic rain, not the kind that announces itself, just the steady, indifferent kind that soaks through everything and doesn't apologize. Diane was still in her scrubs from the overnight shift at Methodist Hospital. She hadn't changed yet. Some nights she came home and changed immediately, like she could wash the shift off her skin. Other nights she just sat in the kitchen in her scrubs and let the quiet settle around her, like something earned. This was one of those nights. She was reaching for the light switch when the knock came. 2 sounds. Firm. Not frantic, not aggressive. Just 2 deliberate knocks on the front door at 11 o'clock at night in the rain. She didn't open it. Not right away. She moved to the window first, the one beside the door that let her see the porch without being seen, and looked out. That was a habit she'd built over years of living alone with a child in a neighborhood where you learned to look before you leaped. The porch light was dim, but enough. An old man stood on the front step. His coat was soaked through dark with rain from the collar down. He had no bag, no suitcase, nothing in his hands except a small cloth notebook he held against his chest like it was the one thing he'd decided to keep dry. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't looking around nervously. He was just standing there, waiting the way a person waits when they've already accepted that the answer might be no. Diane opened the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. Up close, she could see the lines in his face, deep and settled, the kind that come from decades of weather and worry, and probably some things in between. His eyes were steady, not desperate, not performing gratitude in advance, just a man standing in the rain asking a question he hadn't asked yet. He said there was supposed to be a shelter on Vine Street. He'd been told it was still taking people in. She knew the shelter. She also knew it closed intake at 9 o'clock. She told him that. He nodded once, slow, like he'd half expected it. He said thank you and turned and stepped off the porch. She watched him go. 1 step, 2, 3, 4. The rain didn't care about any of it. He walked with the particular carefulness of someone whose body had started requiring more attention than it used to. Each step, placed deliberately, like the ground couldn't be trusted without checking first. His coat was already as wet as it was going to get. She looked back inside. The hallway, the couch, the quiet. She looked at him again. Hey, he stopped. Didn't turn immediately, like he wasn't sure the word was meant for him or if he'd heard it right over the rain. 1 night, she said, just the couch. He turned then. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Not grateful, not relieved. Something else entirely. Something that sat closer to recognition, like he was seeing a thing he had quietly stopped expecting to see in the world. He came back up the steps. She held the door. He stepped inside and stood just past the threshold on the welcome mat, dripping, not moving further, until she moved first. She went to the closet and pulled out a blanket and a pillow and set them on the couch without ceremony. He sat down slowly. He set his bag on the floor beside him. The notebook, though the small cloth one worn at the corners, he kept on his lap. Then he lay back and placed it on his chest, both hands resting on top of it, fingers loosely curled around the edges. He closed his eyes. Diane turned off the kitchen light. She walked down the hall to her bedroom. She turned the lock, not loudly, but deliberately. She lay down and pulled the blanket up and listened to the apartment. Rain on the windows, the low hum of the refrigerator. Nothing else. She didn't sleep for a long time. Not because she thought he would do something, but because she had just let a stranger into the home where her son was sleeping, and the part of her that had spent years learning exactly which doors to lock, and when, was still standing in the hallway, still watching, still not entirely convinced that the part of her that had called him back had made the right call. Both parts were hers. She let them argue in the dark until exhaustion made the decision for her. She didn't remember falling asleep. That was how she knew she finally had. The smell of coffee reached her before the alarm did, dark and real, the kind that comes from an actual pot, not a single-serve machine. Diane opened her eyes and lay still for a moment, listening. The apartment was quiet in the particular way that mornings after rain tend to be, like the city had been rinsed clean overnight and hadn't started making noise again yet. She came out of the bedroom and stopped in the hallway. The couch had been made. Not the way she made it when she bothered a blanket pulled up and a pillow shoved into the corner. This was different. The blanket had been folded into a precise rectangle and placed at one end. The pillow sat centered on top of it, the case smoothed flat, corners aligned, the kind of careful, quiet work that comes from someone who has been a guest before and understands that leaving a space better than you found it is the least you can do. The old man was at the kitchen sink. How was washing the dishes she'd left soaking the night before, the ones she'd been too worn down after her shift to deal with. His hands moved slowly through the water, a faint tremor visible in his fingers, but he held each dish with both hands and set it on the drying rack with deliberate care. The kind of patience that comes not from slowness, but from knowing exactly how much things cost when they break. He didn't hear her at first. Or maybe he did and chose not to make it awkward. Marcus came out of the back bedroom before Diane could figure out what to say. Her son was 8 years old and had not yet learned to be afraid of strangers the way adults teach children to be. He walked straight across the living room, stopped 3 feet from the old man, and looked up at him with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity that only children can pull off without being rude. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. The old man turned off the faucet. He dried his hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle and looked down at the boy. "Just passing through," he said. His voice was even, not unkind. Marcus considered this. Passing through to where? The old man looked at his hands for a moment. He didn't answer. Not because he was hiding something, or at least not only that, but because some questions don't have answers that fit into a kitchen on a Tuesday morning. He hung the dish towel back on the oven handle folded neatly and picked up his notebook from the counter where he'd set it while washing up. Diane poured 3 cups of coffee without being asked. They sat at the kitchen table, her Marcus and the old man, whose name she still didn't know. Marcus asked it plainly, the way he asked everything. The old man said his name was Joe. Just Joe, for now, if that was all right. It was the quietest morning Diane had sat through in 2 years. Not the empty kind of quiet that comes from a house where someone used to be and isn't anymore. A different kind entirely. The kind where nothing needs to be said because nothing is wrong. Over the days that followed, she noticed things. The dripping kitchen faucet stopped dripping. The bathroom door that had squeaked on its hinge since before she could remember went silent. A ceiling light in the hallway that had been flickering for months came on steady and stayed that way. None of it was announced. None of it was negotiated. Each morning she came home from her shift, and something that had been broken was no longer broken. And Joe would be sitting on the couch, reading, or at the table with his coffee, and neither of them mentioned it. On the 4th morning, she asked him what he used to do for work. He told her 35 years at the Memphis Commercial Appeal. A reporter, mostly investigative. The kind of stories, he said, that take a long time to find and longer to prove, and that some people would very much prefer you never finish writing. He said it plainly, without drama, like he was reading facts off a form that belonged to someone he used to be. That afternoon, she found him at the kitchen table, with his notebook open, writing in the small, careful hand she'd noticed before. She asked him what he was writing. He didn't look up. He finished the sentence. He was on, then said, "Everything worth remembering." He closed the notebook and set it beside his coffee cup. She didn't ask what that meant. She wasn't sure she was ready to know. That evening, she left for her overnight shift at the hospital and did something she hadn't planned on doing. She sat in her car in the driveway for 3 full minutes without starting the engine. Through the kitchen window, She could see the warm yellow light and the shape of Joe on the couch, a paperback open in his lap. Marcus was in there somewhere, probably already arguing about bedtime. She had left her son in that house with a man she'd known for 4 days. She turned the key. The engine caught. She pulled out of the driveway and didn't let herself look back. She came home on the 4th day, and something was different before she even reached the front door. A dark sedan was parked along the curb directly across from the house. Black, or close to it, in the fading afternoon light. Engine off, windows up. No one getting out, no one getting in. Just sitting there the way a car sits when the person inside it has decided they have time and you don't. Diane had lived on this block for 3 years. She knew every vehicle that belonged here. Mrs. Patterson's minivan, the Garza family's pickup with the cracked taillight, the rotating cast of her neighbor, Darnell's friends, who double parked on weekends. This car didn't belong to any of them. She would have noticed it before. She went inside without looking at it too long. Joe was in the living room. He was sitting on the couch with his notebook closed on the cushion beside him, and he was looking out the front window. Not reading, not resting, just watching the street with the quiet, steady attention of someone who had been doing exactly that for a while before she walked in. That was the thing she noticed. Not the car, not right away, but him, the way he was positioned, the particular quality of his stillness. It was different from the stillness of a man reading or thinking. It was the stillness of a man paying attention. She asked him about the car. He didn't pretend not to know which one she meant. He looked at her for a moment, measuring something she couldn't name, and then he said, "Some people don't like what I know." She waited. When he didn't continue, she said, "What do you know?" He said, "Enough to matter." And then he picked up his notebook and opened it, which was either a way of changing the subject or a way of saying that was all he intended to give her right now. She didn't push. Not yet. There was something in the way he'd said it. Not evasive, not frightened, but deliberate, like a man parceling out information, in the order he'd decided it needed to come, that told her pushing would not get her anywhere. He wasn't already planning to go. Marcus came home from school. They had dinner. The car outside didn't move. Later that evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, and the dishes were done, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered because she always answered unknown numbers. You had a kid in school and a mother with a heart condition, and you learned not to let calls go to voicemail. The voice on the other end was calm, male, the kind of calm that isn't natural, but practiced, like someone who had made this kind of call before and had decided that steady was more effective than threatening. He said her name. Then he said, "The man in your house is not who you think he is. Ask him what happened in 2019. And then the line went dead. She stood in the kitchen holding the phone. In the living room, Joe was sitting exactly where he'd been all evening. When she came through the doorway, he looked up. He didn't ask who had called. He didn't ask what they'd said. He just looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the look of a man who had already done the math on a situation and was waiting to see if the other person had gotten there yet. She sat down across from him. She set the phone on the table between them, face up, like evidence. "Who called me?" she said. Joe looked at the phone. Then he looked at her. "Someone who wants me gone before I finish." "Finish what?" He didn't answer right away. He set his notebook on the table beside the phone and laced his fingers together and looked at the middle distance between them, the way people do when they're deciding not how much of the truth to tell, but in what order to tell it. He stood and moved to the window. The dark sedan was still there, just visible under the amber wash of the streetlight, engine still off, no sign of life inside it. "I'll tell you tomorrow," he said, without turning around. "Tonight, I need you to trust me one more night." Diane looked at the back of his head, at the car beyond the glass, at the phone still on the table between the 2 empty chairs. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She stood up, walked down the hallway, and closed her bedroom door behind her. She did not lock it this time. She wasn't sure what that meant, but it meant something. The coffee was already made when she came out of the bedroom. That was the first thing. The second was that Joe was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around his mug, the notebook closed and flat on the table in front of him. And he was not reading, not writing, not looking out the window. He was just sitting there, waiting in the particular way of someone who has made a decision overnight and is ready to follow through on it in the morning. Marcus had already left for school. The apartment held that specific weekday quiet that only exists after a child has gone backpack, gone from the hook by the door cereal bowl, rinsed and left in the rack. The energy of the place shifted slightly toward stillness. Diane poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. He started talking without being asked. In the spring of 2019, he told her he had been working on an investigation that took him nearly 2 years to piece together. A network of property managers, city inspectors, and a handful of officials whose names she might recognize from local news people who had spent the better part of a decade quietly pushing low-income families out of South and Mid-Memphis through a system of fraudulent code violations, inflated fines, and selective enforcement. Families who couldn't afford lawyers got buried in paperwork until they gave up and left. The buildings were then sold renovated and flipped at prices the original tenants could never have afforded to return to. He published the story in late 2019. 3 people were formally charged. All 3 were eventually convicted and went away. The paper let him go 6 months after the story ran. Budget cuts, they said. He knew better than to argue with what he couldn't prove. He lost his apartment the following year when the savings ran out. His wife had already been gone for 3 years by then. Not gone the way people leave, but gone the way illness takes people slowly over time, until one morning the house just holds what's left of them, and none of the rest. He said all of this, the way people recount events that have finished hurting in the sharp way, and now just sit in the background like weather present, factored in, no longer surprising. Then, he said, one of the 3 people who had been sent away was released 6 months ago, and that the investigation he never finished, the one that would have named 4 more people instead of 3, was in the notebook. That he said was why the car was outside. Diane wrapped both hands around her mug. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "You said you didn't come to my door by accident, but not for the reason I'm thinking." She paused. Then why? He looked at her. Not the way he usually looked at her, measured, careful parceling, but directly, like he had decided to stop doing that for the next few minutes. "Because 8 months ago," he said, "you said something to me outside a hospital, and I wrote it down." He let that land. "I've been writing things down for 2 years, keeping a record of." He paused, choosing the word carefully. Moments. People. The ones that stayed with me. He looked at the notebook on the table between them. "Yours was different." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. "What did I say?" she asked. He placed his hand over the notebook. Not possessively, but gently. The way you cover something you're not ready to uncover yet. "You'll know when it's time," he said. She looked at the notebook under his hand, at the worn cloth cover and the soft corners and the faint crease down the spine from being opened and closed more times than she could count. She had seen him write in it, seen him hold it, seen him carry it from room to room. Like it was the one thing in the world he was absolutely certain he still owned. For the first time since he'd walked through her door, she found herself genuinely wanting to know what was inside it. Not to satisfy suspicion, not to confirm or deny anything, just because whatever was in there had apparently been important enough to carry for 2 years, through everything he'd described, and something that survives all of that tends to be worth knowing. She didn't ask again. She refilled her coffee, and they sat for a while longer, in the kind of quiet that means something different than it did the day before. Gloria Washington had lived 2 doors down for as long as Diane had been on this block, and in all that time, Diane had never once seen the woman wait for anything sitting down. When Gloria had something to say, she stood. It was a posture that communicated without a single word that what was coming had been thought through and was not going to be walked back. She was standing at her front gate when Diane came up the sidewalk that evening, arms folded, not crossed, defensively, but settled, the way someone stands when they've been waiting a reasonable amount of time and are prepared to wait a little more. Gloria was 69 years old, had raised 4 children, mostly on her own, and had the particular quality of older women who have seen enough of life to know the difference between a problem that will sort itself out and one that will not. Marcus showed me his drawings, she said, before Diane had even reached the gate. Diane slowed. He draws all the time. He showed me 4 of them. Same person in all 4. Gloria looked at her steadily. That boy has already decided something about that man in your house. You know that. Diane said what she'd been saying to herself for days. He's leaving soon. Gloria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just looked at Diane the way she always looked at her. When Diane was saying something neither of them believed and said, "You said that Tuesday." That was all. 4 words. But they landed the way true things land when you've been carefully on saying them to yourself. Not loud, just precise. Diane didn't have an answer for it because there wasn't one, and Gloria knew it, and that was exactly why she'd said it standing up. Diane walked home, carrying that sentence, the rest of the way down the block. She smelled the food before she opened the door. Not reheated food. Not something from a box. Real cooking, something with onions and garlic gone soft in a pan. Something that had been given time and attention. The kind of smell that fills a kitchen first, and then the hallway. And then if you're not careful, something in you that you'd forgotten was empty. Joe was at the stove. Marcus was at the kitchen table, still in his school clothes, talking at a speed that suggested he had been holding the story in since 3 o'clock, and had finally found someone patient enough to receive it in full. Something about a substitute teacher, and a fire drill, and a misunderstanding involving a basketball that had, according to Marcus, not been entirely his fault. Joe was listening. Actually listening, not the half-present nod that adults give children when they're thinking about something else, but the full attention of someone who had decided this particular story deserved it. Diane set her bag down by the door and sat at the table. They ate together, all 3 of them at the table, with plates and forks, and a conversation that moved the way conversations move when nobody is trying too hard to have one. Marcus did most of the talking. Joe asked the kind of questions that made Marcus talk more. Diane ate and listened, and felt somewhere beneath the ordinary sounds of the meal. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. After a while, Joe talked about some of the people he'd written about over the years. Not the corrupt ones, the other kind. A woman in North Memphis who had spent 11 years fighting a rezoning decision by herself, showing up to every city council meeting until they finally had to answer her. A high school janitor who had quietly been tutoring students after hours for 2 decades without telling anyone. People, he said, who had decided to do the right thing in the particular absence of anyone making it easy for them. He stopped mid-sentence, just for a beat. He looked at Diane across the table in a way that lasted a moment longer than the conversation required, then continued on to something else, like the pause hadn't happened. She noticed it. She didn't say anything about it. Later, sitting at her own kitchen table, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, not eating in the car, between shifts, not standing at the counter, because sitting felt like a luxury she hadn't earned. She understood something she'd been circling around for days. She wasn't only worried about Marcus getting attached to someone who was going to leave. She was worried about herself. That was a different problem, one she didn't have a solution for yet. She was still thinking about it when she turned off the light and got into bed. She lay in the dark, listening to the apartment settle into its nighttime sounds. The refrigerator, a car passing outside, the quiet, and then, somewhere past midnight, the softest sound, footsteps in the hallway, almost nothing, and then the front door opening and closing with the careful deliberateness of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Then silence. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, turning the sound over in her mind. She didn't get up. She didn't check. She just lay there, with it the way you hold something you don't understand yet and aren't sure you're ready to. In the morning, she didn't ask. She found the sketchbook while she was straightening up his room that morning, tucked between the mattress and the wall. The way Marcus stored things he considered important, but not secret. He was not a secretive kid. He just had his own system of safekeeping that didn't always make sense to anyone but him. She sat on the edge of his bed and opened it. The first few pages were the usual things, a dog he'd seen in the park, something that was either a spaceship or a very ambitious school bus. A portrait of Gloria that captured her expression with uncomfortable accuracy. Then a page of the kitchen table from above, which meant he'd drawn it, standing on his chair again. Then Joe on the couch reading. Joe at the kitchen sink. Joe crouching by the cabinet under the bathroom vanity, with what appeared to be a wrench. She smiled at that one. He'd gotten the tremor in the hands, right? The careful, deliberate grip that was both a limitation and a kind of precision. She turned the page and stopped. The drawing was in darker pencil than the others, pressed harder into the paper. It showed the side of the house, the exterior wall, the window of Marcus's bedroom, the narrow strip of yard between the house and the sidewalk. And standing just outside the window, facing the street, was a figure. Tall, thin, hands in his coat pockets, head turned slightly toward the road. It was nighttime in the drawing. Marcus had filled in the sky with long, heavy strokes. Diane sat very still. She called Marcus in from the living room. He appeared in the doorway, looked at the sketchbook in her hands, and came over without being asked to explain himself, which meant he didn't think there was anything to explain. She pointed to the drawing. "I wasn't looking at me, Mom," Marcus said, with the patient tone of a child, clarifying something obvious. "He was watching the street. Every night you work." She kept her voice even. "Every night," Marcus nodded. "He goes out after I'm asleep. I saw him one time, when I got up for water. He was just standing there." He paused, considering. "He stays until your headlights come down the street. Then he comes back in." Diane set the sketchbook down on the bed. She went outside through the back door and walked around to the side of the house, to the narrow strip of ground beneath Marcus's window. The soil was still soft from the recent rain. The impressions were there. Boot prints, side by side, facing the street. Not one set, not two, several overlapping, slightly worn into the ground, the way a mark gets worn when a person returns to the same spot again and again over a period of days. She stood there for a moment, looking at them. Then she went back inside. Joe was at the kitchen table with his coffee, the notebook closed in front of him. He looked up when she came through the door. She looked at him, the particular kind of looking that doesn't need to build to anything, because everything has already been understood. Neither of them said a word. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. And they stayed like that for a while, two people on the same side of something neither of them had fully named yet, sitting in the quiet that had been between them from the beginning, only now it meant something more than it had before. She thought about the nights she'd driven home from the hospital at 6 in the morning, exhausted, in the specific way that overnight shifts produce, turning onto her street on autopilot. She thought about how the house always looked the same when she pulled up porch light on windows dark, everything in order. She hadn't known someone was making sure of that. Later that afternoon, Marcus came back to his room and sat cross-legged on the floor with a fresh sheet of paper and his pencil spread out in front of him. Diane leaned against the doorframe and watched without interrupting. He drew the front of the house this time, the porch, the steps, the oak tree at the edge of the yard. 3 figures stood in front of it, a woman, a boy, and a tall, thin man, with his hands in his pockets. Behind them, the street stretched back into darkness, but the darkness was empty. No shapes in it, no suggestion of anything lurking or waiting. Just open space, the way a child draws night, when night is simply the absence of day, and not something to be afraid of. Marcus held the drawing out at arm's length, considered it, and appeared satisfied. Diane looked at it for a long time after he set it down. She was moving before she was fully awake. That was how it worked. Sometimes the body heard something the sleeping mind hadn't processed yet and made the decision to respond before the rest of you caught up. She was in the hallway before she understood what had pulled her out of sleep, and in the kitchen doorway before she understood what she was looking at. The window above the sink had been broken from the outside, not shattered, one clean impact, a hole the size of a fist. Near the center of the lower pane, the surrounding glass fractured outward in a starburst. The November air was coming through it, cold and indifferent, lifting the edge of the dish towel on the counter. On the kitchen floor, among the scattered glass, was a rock the size of a man's palm, and a folded piece of paper that had been wrapped around it with a rubber band. She reached for the light switch. Don't turn on the light. Joe was standing in the doorway to the hallway, fully dressed, like he hadn't been to sleep at all, or had gotten up the moment he heard it. His voice was quiet and flat, not panicked, not surprised. The voice of someone for whom this was not the first time a window had carried a message. She left the light off. He crossed the kitchen, carefully, stepping around the glass in his boots, and crouched down to pick up the paper. He unfolded it, read it in the thin light coming through the broken pane from the street lamp outside, then folded it again and put it in his coat pocket. She waited. What does it say? He straightened up. He looked at her across the dark kitchen. It says, I need to finish what I started. A pause. And I'm close. She looked toward this hallway. Marcus's door was still closed. No sound from inside. Kids that age could sleep through almost anything, and for once she was grateful for it. Joe followed her gaze. He's fine, he said. Then quieter. I need 2 more days. 2 days and then what? He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was dark, except for the cold light from outside, and the faint orange glow of the stove clock. His face was composed in the way faces get when the person wearing them has made peace with something you haven't been told about yet. Then it won't matter where I am, he said. The sentence had edges she didn't want to press against. It could mean several things, and she understood in that moment that asking which one he meant would not get her an answer she was ready for. Some truths had a timing to them, and she had learned over the course of the past week that Joe understood timing better than almost anyone she'd met. She went to the closet in the hallway and got the broom. She came back and swept up the glass without speaking. Joe found a piece of cardboard from the recycling bin and cut it to fit the window frame, taping it over the opening with the roll of packing tape from the junk drawer. They worked in the dark quietly, without ceremony. When it was done, the cardboard held, and the cold air stopped moving through the kitchen. She put the broom away. He went back to the couch. She went back to bed. She didn't sleep again. In the morning, she came out to find the apartment empty. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. The blanket on the couch had been folded, though not in the careful, precise way of his first morning. Just folded, like a man who had left in a hurry or with other things on his mind. The notebook was on the kitchen table. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked at it. In 11 days, she had never once seen him leave without it. He carried it the way some people carry their keys or their phone, not consciously, just as a matter of course, because it was always supposed to be on his person. It went to the bathroom with him. It sat on the floor beside the couch while he slept. It was the last thing he touched before bed and the first thing he reached for in the morning. And now it was sitting in the middle of the kitchen table, alone in a house he was not in. She stood there for a long time. She did not cross the room. She did not reach for it. Whatever was in it had always been his, and whatever he was doing today had led him to leave it behind. And both of those facts belonged to him in a way she didn't feel it was her place to disturb. She went to the counter and put the coffee on instead. He came back in the late afternoon when the light had gone flat and gray, the way Memphis light does in November, before it gives up entirely and becomes dark. The door opened, and he came in and set his bag down by the couch without explanation. He didn't offer one, and she didn't ask for one. That was something they had arrived at without discussing it, a kind of mutual understanding that some things would be accounted for eventually. And until then, the asking could wait. She was at the stove. He sat down at the kitchen table. Marcus looked up from his homework, said hey, and went back to his worksheet. They ate dinner the way they'd been eating it together, without much ceremony. The food was simple. The conversation belonged mostly to Marcus, and by 8 o'clock, her son had talked himself into tiredness and gone to bed without the usual negotiation about it. Joe stayed at the table after the dishes were done. He reached into his bag and pulled out a laptop, old the kind, with a cracked hinge, held together with a strip of electrical tape along one side, and opened it. The screen threw a pale light across the table. He didn't say what he was doing. He just started typing. Diane read for a while, on the couch. Around 10, she said goodnight. He nodded without looking up, fingers still moving. She wasn't sure what woke her at 4 in the morning. Not a sound, exactly, more like the absence of one. The apartment had a texture to its silence at that hour, and something in it felt different. She got up and went to the kitchen for water. How was still there. The overhead light was off. The only light in the room came from the laptop screen, a cool blue rectangle in the dark, and it lit the angles of his face from below in a way that made him look older than he was, and also somehow more settled, like a man who had finally arrived somewhere after a very long time of traveling. She didn't speak. She got her glass of water and sat down across from him, not close enough to see the screen, just present. He didn't acknowledge her, and she didn't require him to. Some company doesn't need to announce itself to count. She watched him work. His hands moved slowly, the tremor visible, even in the low light, but they moved with intention. Each sentence considered, each word placed. The kind of writing that isn't fast, because it isn't trying to be fast, it's trying to be right. He had been doing this, she understood, for 2 years, carrying it from shelter to shelter, from bench to bench, finishing it in other people's kitchens, in library corners, and church basements, always getting closer, never quite done. Until now, he typed one last line. Read it over, read it again. Then he moved the cursor, clicked once, and sat back. The laptop screen went to a sent confirmation. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the lid. The kitchen went dark, except for the thin orange glow of the stove clock. It's done, he said. 2 words. Quietly. Not triumphant, not relieved, just finished. The way a very long thing sounds when it finally reaches its last syllable. He looked toward the window. Outside, the street was empty. The stretch of curb where the dark sedan had been parked for days held nothing but shadow in the faint reflection of the street lamp on wet asphalt. The car was gone. He sat for another moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he placed both hands flat on the table and pushed himself to standing. He moved toward the sofa in the particular careful way he always moved, deliberate, measured one step at a time. He made it to the middle of the room. Then his right knee went, and the rest of him followed, not all at once, but in the slow, collapsing way of someone whose body has simply run out of whatever it had been running on. Diane was on her feet before he reached the floor. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and got her hands under his arm and around his back. And she registered this in the fraction of a second. She had to register anything heavier than she'd expected, or lighter. She genuinely couldn't tell, because her hands were just holding on. And that was the only thing that mattered at that particular moment. He didn't fight it. He let her hold him. That more than anything told her something she hadn't known before. The first thing she registered was his breathing. Not the floor beneath her knees, not the cold coming through the cardboard patched window in the kitchen, not the dark. Just the sound of air moving in and out of him, steady, slow, present. She held on to that sound, the way you hold on to something solid when everything else is uncertain. She got him to the couch. It took a moment. His legs had not fully decided to cooperate, but he was not a man who made things harder than they needed to be, and between the 2 of them, they managed it without drama. He sat on the edge of the cushion, breathing carefully, like someone taking inventory of what still worked. Diane's hands moved on instinct. 11 years of overnight shifts had built certain responses into her body that didn't wait for permission. Her fingers found his wrist. Don't, he said, not harshly, not embarrassed, just a man drawing a clear line in the only place he had left to draw one. She pulled her hand back. Okay, she said. She got the blanket from the end of the couch and spread it over him. He lay back slowly, and his hands moved without him seeming to direct them, reaching beside him, finding the notebook on the cushion where she'd set it earlier, lifting it to his chest. His fingers wrapped around the edges the way they always did. Both hands, the grip of someone holding the one thing they were absolutely sure belonged to them. He closed his eyes. The apartment was very quiet. The stove clock read 4:17. Through the wall, Marcus slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of children who do not yet know enough to lie awake worrying. Thank you, Diane. His voice was low, almost private, like something said to the room rather than to her specifically. But her name was in it, and she understood that was intentional. In 18 days, through coffee and repairs and dinners and silences, and a broken window, and a sent email, and everything in between. He had not said those words once. Not because he was ungrateful, she had understood that much for a while now, but because he was the kind of man who saved certain things for when they were exactly true. She sat down on the floor beside the sofa, put her back against the coffee table, stretched her legs out in front of her, and looked up at the ceiling. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure what she felt was the kind of thing that came out as crying. It was more like something had been set down, some weight she'd been carrying in a direction she hadn't fully identified. And now it was just there on the floor beside her, and she was sitting next to it in the dark. She looked at his hands. The tremor was still there, even in sleep. A faint, involuntary movement in the fingers, the body doing what it did, regardless of rest. She looked at those hands and thought about what they had done in the weeks since he'd walked through her door. The faucet, the hinge, the ceiling light, the boots on wet ground outside her son's window. Every night she was gone. The laptop keys in the dark. She didn't know what promise those hands had been keeping. She didn't know who it had been made to, or how long ago, or at what cost. But she recognized a promise being fulfilled when she saw one. She had watched enough people in enough hospital rooms to know what that looked like on a person's face when they finally got there. The first gray light of morning found the window. Not sunrise. Memphis didn't do anything that gentle in November. Just a slow, reluctant lightening of the dark. Outside the glass, blue-edged and cold, the kind of early morning that arrives before the world has decided to commit to the day. From down the hall came the small, rustling sound of Marcus turning over in his sleep. Diane stayed where she was. The floor was hard, and the hour was late, and the day was going to come, whether she was ready for it or not. She was not ready for it yet. The key turned in the lock the same way it always did. That was the first thing she noticed. Not what had changed, but what hadn't. The deadbolt, the handle, the familiar resistance and release of a door she had opened 6 mornings a week for 3 years. Everything on the outside was exactly as she'd left it. Inside was different. She felt it before she saw anything, a quality to the silence that was not the silence of a sleeping house or an empty house, but something in between, the silence of a place where someone had recently been and had decided carefully and deliberately to no longer be. The couch told her the rest. The blanket had been folded and placed at one end, but not the way Joe had been folding it every morning for the past 2.5 weeks. That precise, considered rectangle she had come to recognize as his particular standard of courtesy. This fold was different, flatter, the kind of fold that takes more time, not less. Every crease pressed down, every corner squared, the pillow centered on top, with its case smoothed to a surface she could have run a ruler across. The kind of order a person leaves behind when they are not planning to come back and want to make sure the space looks exactly right for whoever comes after them. His bag was gone. His coat was gone. His boots were gone. On the kitchen table, side by side, the notebook and a piece of paper folded in 4. She stood at the edge of the kitchen for a moment, then crossed to the table and picked up the paper. The handwriting was small and careful, the letters slightly slanted, pressed firmly enough into the page that she could feel the impressions on the back with her thumb. It said, "The story needed a witness. You were always going to be her. Your mother knew that before either of us did." She read it once. She read it again. The third time, she set it down on the table and stood there with her hands flat on either side of it, looking at the words. She understood parts of it, the witness part, the story part, those connected to things he'd told her or almost told her in the days leading up to this one. But her mother, that part sat on the page like a door she didn't have a key for yet, and she understood instinctively that pushing on it right now, before she knew enough, would only take her somewhere she wasn't prepared to go. She left it on the table. Marcus came out of his room at 7:15, still in his pajamas, hair sideways from sleep. He walked into the living room and stopped. He looked at the couch, at the folded blanket, the smoothed pillow, the absence of the person who had been there every morning when he came out. He walked over to it slowly and sat down in the spot where Joe always slept, right in the center of the middle cushion, and placed one hand on the armrest. He sat there for a while without saying anything. Then he stood up, went back to his room, and came back with his sketchbook and a fistful of pencils. He settled onto the floor in front of the coffee table and opened to a blank page and began to draw with the focused, private attention of someone who has decided that this is how they are going to handle the morning. Diane watched him for a moment. Then she looked at the rest of the apartment. The kitchen faucet was silent. No drip, nothing. The bathroom door swung open and closed on its hinge without a sound. The back door, which she tested out of some impulse she couldn't name, latched on the first try, clean and flush, the way it hadn't in 2 years, before a week ago. She walked through each room slowly, not looking for him. She already knew he wasn't there, but taking account of what he'd left behind. Everything he had touched still worked. She came back to the kitchen and stood at the table with the notebook and the note. The note she folded back into quarters and held in her hand. Then she pulled open the junk drawer, the one beside the stove that held all the things a household accumulates that don't belong anywhere specific, and looked inside. A past due utility reminder, a permission slip for Marcus's field trip, a pen with no cap that had probably run dry months ago. The ordinary inventory of an ordinary life continuing. She put the note in the drawer next to the permission slip and closed it. She had a shift starting at 10 tonight. She needed to sleep for a few hours, and then she needed to make sure Marcus had something for dinner, and then she needed to get herself to the hospital and do her job. She put the coffee on. 3 weeks passed, the way time passes after something has shifted. Not slowly, not quickly, but with a different weight than before. Like the same number of hours now carried more in them than they used to. The apartment was the same. The faucet didn't drip. The hinge didn't squeak. The back door latched clean on the first try every time, the way a back door should. All of it exactly as he'd left it. She had started thinking of the apartment in those terms, not as things that worked, but as things he had made work, which was different in a way she didn't have precise words for, but felt clearly enough. She read the notebook most evenings after Marcus went to bed, not searching for anything specific, not trying to decode it or prepare herself for whatever came next. She just read the entries, the dates, the locations, the small careful sentences about small careful acts of decency, and let them do whatever they did to her, which was something in the neighborhood of comfort and something in the neighborhood of grief, and not entirely either one. At work something had changed in the way she moved through her shifts. Methodist Hospital's overnight ward had a particular rhythm, the same rounds, the same checks, the same hallways at the same hours, the same faces in the same rooms, with the same needs, cycling through on their own schedule. Diane had worked it long enough that efficiency had become a kind of default, the way it does for anyone who has done a job well for years. You learned to move without wasting motion. You learned which patients needed more and which needed less, and how to allocate yourself accordingly. The man in room 14 asked the same 3 questions every night. He wanted to know what time it was. He wanted to know if his daughter had called. He wanted to know if the rain had stopped. The dementia had taken the part of him that retained answers, but it hadn't touched the part that needed to ask. He asked at 10 o'clock, and again at midnight, and sometimes again at 3. And the answers were always the same. It's 10:15, not yet, but I'll let you know. Yes, the rain stopped this afternoon, and he received them each time as if they were new information, which for him they were. She had been giving him the efficient version for months. Accurate, sufficient, appropriate to the pace of a ward at that hour. She started staying longer. Not much, 3 minutes, 4. Enough to sit on the edge of the chair beside his bed instead of standing at the door. Enough to answer the 3rd question, and then ask one back. He couldn't always follow a conversation, but he could follow the presence of another person, and she found that was often what the question was really asking for. A colleague named Renata noticed. She asked about it one evening at the nurse's station, the way colleagues ask about things they've observed but aren't sure they're supposed to mention. He reminds me of someone, Diane said. Renata nodded like that, explained it because it did. It was on a Thursday night. somewhere around 3 in the morning, that Diane found herself standing at the window at the end of the East Corridor. It was a window she passed 6 or 8 times a shift without stopping. That night, she stopped. The window faced the side entrance of the hospital, the service door off the east parking lot, the one staff used for smoke breaks, and the one delivery drivers used at odd hours. She looked out at the narrow strip of concrete below the single overhead light mounted above the door, the bench along the wall that had been there as long as she'd worked at the hospital. And she remembered 8 months ago, a night in early spring, still cold enough to see your breath. She had been on her way back in from a break when she noticed a man sitting on that bench, older, thin coat, sitting very still in the way that people sit when they have been still for a long time and have stopped expecting anything to change. She had gone back inside, gotten a cup of coffee from the machine in the staff lounge, the kind that came in a paper cup and was not particularly good, and brought it out. She had said one thing to him. Then she had gone back inside and finished her shift and forgotten about it before she drove home the way you forget the small, unremarkable moments of a night that holds 100 of them. She stood at the window now and looked at that bench and understood something she had not been able to assemble from the other direction. She had said, "You don't have to be invisible," to a man she had forgotten within the hour. And he had written it down. He had carried it from that bench through 8 months of everything his life had been since then, all the way to the front step of her house in the November rain. He had held on to it the way you hold on to something that tells you a thing you needed to know about the world, that it still contained people who saw you, that being seen was still possible, that it was worth continuing to move through the days until you found out what came next. She had not known she was saying anything important. She stood at the window for a long time. On Saturday afternoon, she was in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the notebook open on the table when the knock came. Not Gloria's knock, 3 quick raps, with the knuckle impatient and familiar. Not the loose casual knock of a neighbor returning something borrowed. 2 firm sounds, a pause, then 2 more, measured, deliberate. The knock of someone who had rehearsed it, or who knocked that way by habit, because they had learned that how you announce yourself matters. She set her coffee cup down on the counter. The man at the door was somewhere around 45, in a navy suit that fit well enough to have been chosen carefully and worn often. He carried a brown leather briefcase at his side and had a laminated badge clipped to his breast pocket, the kind that identified, rather than authorized, the kind that said, "I am here officially, and I would like you to know that before we begin." He had the bearing of someone who had delivered difficult news before and had learned to do it without making it about himself. Not cold, not rehearsed, just steady in the way that certain professionals get steady, when steadiness is the most useful thing they can offer. Diane had grown up, understanding that when a person in a suit appeared at the door of someone like her, it was rarely to deliver anything she'd been hoping for. Eviction notices, debt collection, a certified letter from a court. That understanding was not bitterness. It was pattern recognition, built from years of watching it happen to people she knew, and it lived in her body before her mind had fully processed who was standing on her porch. She kept one hand on the doorframe. He introduced himself as Daniel Park, an attorney with a firm downtown. He said he was there regarding a matter involving a former client. He said the client's name. Something shifted in her chest. Not her heart, exactly. Something behind it, something she didn't have a precise anatomical word for, but felt clearly, a kind of movement that happens when a name lands differently than you expected it to. She said, "Is he okay?" Daniel Park looked at her. Not at his briefcase, not at the folder she could see tucked under his arm. At her. He held that look for just long enough, a breath, maybe 2, and in that pause, the question answered itself before he said a single word. Joe had passed away 9 days ago, he told her, at a hospice facility on the south side of Memphis. He had been receiving care there for just over 3 weeks. He had checked himself in 2 days after leaving her home. Everything had been arranged in advance. The paperwork, the instructions, all of it prepared and in order before he had ever knocked on her door. Diane sat down. Not inside. She didn't move back into the house. She sat down on the front step, the top step of the porch, the one closest to the door, the same concrete surface she had stood on 11 weeks ago when the rain was coming down, and an old man had walked up those same 3 stairs and asked about a shelter on Vine Street. Same battered railing on the left, same crack in the corner of the second step where a tree root had pushed up from underneath sometime in the last decade, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. Daniel Park stood on the porch above her. He did not check his watch. He did not shift his weight impatiently, or clear his throat, or do any of the things people do when they want someone to finish feeling something, so the next part can begin. He simply stood there, briefcase at his side, and waited with the particular patience of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds belonged to her. She looked at the street, at the elm tree across the road, losing its last few leaves in the thin December wind, at Mrs. Patterson's minivan in the next driveway, at the ordinary, continuing world that had no idea what she was sitting with. After a while, she stood up. They went inside. She cleared the notebook and her coffee cup from the kitchen table without thinking about it. The automatic hospitality of someone who has always made space for others, even when space was the one thing she had least of. Daniel set his briefcase on a chair and laid the folder on the table and opened it with the care of someone who had handled these particular documents more than once and understood their weight. He turned the first page toward her. There was a number on it, a specific, documented, notarized number, representing the remaining balance of an escrow account after the settlement of outstanding obligations from the proceeds of a property sale. $47,000. She read it once. Then she read it again, the way you reread something, when your mind insists the first reading must have been wrong. Then she looked up at Daniel Park. That's not possible, she said. He met her eyes without flinching. It's documented and notarized. I let him sleep on my couch, she said. That's all I did. 18 days, and I let him sleep on my couch. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, and without any particular emphasis, as though it were simply the most accurate thing available, Miss Holloway, he knew you. She looked at the number again. Then she pushed the paper back across the table toward him, not rudely, just with the particular firmness of someone who has made a decision and needs the other person to understand it is already made. I can't take this, she said. I let him sleep on my couch. That's all I did. Daniel didn't push the paper back. He left it where it had landed and reached into the folder and withdrew a second sheet, a single page, handwritten the paper, slightly thicker than standard, the kind you buy when you intend something to last. According to Mr. Webb, he said, that is not all you did. He set the page on the table and smoothed it once with the flat of his hand. He asked me to read this to you. He was specific about that I read it, not hand it over. He said you would understand why when you heard it. He looked at her. She nodded once. Hen began. 8 months before he knocked on her door. The letter said he had been sitting on the bench outside the east entrance of Methodist Hospital on a night in early spring. He had been there for several hours. A woman in scrubs had come out of the side door, gone back inside briefly, and returned with a cup of coffee from the machine in the staff lounge. She had set it down beside him. She had said one thing. Then she had gone back inside. He had written her name down. The badge had been turned slightly, but he had been a reporter for 35 years, and reading partially obscured text was a skill that did not leave you. Daniel continued reading. Joe had kept the name. Over the following months, as he worked to finish what he had started, he had made it his business to learn enough to know she was safe, her schedule, her neighborhood, the hours her son came and went. Not to intrude, the letter was careful to say, but to make sure that the door he intended to knock on belonged to someone who would still be standing on the other side of whatever came next. He had chosen her door on purpose. He had stood outside her son's window on the nights she worked, not because he doubted the neighborhood, but because he understood better than most what it cost a person to leave a child sleeping in a house and drive away into the dark, and he had wanted her to be able to drive back to something intact. Daniel's voice was even as he read. He did not editorialize. He simply delivered the words in the order they had been written. Then he reached the next paragraph. There had been a woman in South Memphis, the letter said, 22 years ago. A woman who had agreed to speak on record when no one else would, who had shown up to every meeting, signed every document, put her name on things that other people were afraid to put their names on, who had made a promise to him that she intended to outlast whatever they were both up against. He had made a promise back. Hein had not been able to keep it. Not then. Hein had spent 22 years carrying that. Your mother's name was Pearl, Daniel read. Diane's hand came up. Stop. Daniel stopped. The kitchen held the word for a moment. The refrigerator ran. From down the hallway came the faint sound of a cartoon playing in Marcus's room. And then that sound stopped too, replaced by a silence that meant a small boy had put down whatever he was doing and was now very still. Say that again, Diane said. Daniel looked at the page, then at her. Your mother's name was Pearl, he said. He paused, reading ahead. He said you would need a moment. He said to give you as long as you needed. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at the low angle it took in December, lying flat across the table, across the folder, across her hands. She did not move them. She sat with the light on her hands and the name in the room, and the refrigerator running, and the hallway, perfectly quiet, and let the thing that was happening happen at whatever speed it needed to. After a while, she looked up. Daniel reached into the briefcase. He did not take out another document. He took out something she recognized before he had fully set it on the table. The worn cloth cover, the soft corners, the crease down the spine. The notebook. She looked at it the way you look at something you have seen every day in one context and are now seeing in another, which is to say, like you are seeing it for the first time. He said, there's one more thing, Daniel told her. He turned the notebook so the cover faced her. Page 47. He said, you'll know when you're ready. Daniel had gone. She didn't remember walking him to the door or what either of them had said at the end. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the folder to one side and the notebook in front of her, and the winter light coming through the window at a lower angle than before, which meant time had passed without her tracking it. Marcus came out of the hallway. He didn't ask anything. He crossed the kitchen and pulled out the chair beside her and sat down in it and put both hands flat on the table, the way he did when he was settling in for something. He was 9 years old, and he had been listening from the hallway, and he had understood enough to know that what was happening in this kitchen was something he wanted to be present for, even if he couldn't have explained exactly why. She looked at him once. Then she opened the notebook. The early pages held what she had already read over the past 3 weeks. The dated entries, the small, careful observations, the record of moments that had happened to a man moving through the world with very little and choosing anyway to pay attention to what was good in it. A woman at a gas station who had refilled his coffee without being asked. A librarian who had let him stay past closing and called him sir. A teenager who had given him half a sandwich and pretended it was extra. She turned the pages slowly. Somewhere past the middle of the notebook, the entries became less frequent. The handwriting changed slightly. Still careful, but more deliberate, like someone writing with more intention and less habit. And then between pages 46 and 48, she felt it before she saw it, a slight thickness, the way a page feels when something is tucked inside it. She opened to page 47. A photograph, black and white printed on the kind of paper that aged to a slight yellow at the edges. It showed a crowd of people gathered in front of a low brick building she didn't recognize, holding handwritten signs she couldn't fully read. The kind of gathering that happens when people have run out of quieter options. She looked at the crowd. Her eyes moved the way eyes move over an image they are searching for something specific, and even before the mind has decided what that something is. Then she found it. Left side of the frame, slightly toward the back of the crowd. A woman standing with her chin up and her shoulders square, in the particular posture of someone who has decided that being seen is necessary, regardless of the cost. She was younger than Diane had ever known her. Her hair was different, her face was unlined, her coat was one Diane had never seen. But the way she stood, the angle of her jaw, the expression that was not defiance exactly, but something that lived right next door to it. Diane set the photograph down on the table. Marcus leaned over to look at it. Mom, he said. Is that Grandma? She turned it over. The handwriting on the back was the same small, careful slant she had come to know. It said, "Pearl Holloway, the bravest person I ever interviewed. Her daughter deserves to know." She sat with that for a moment. Then she reached for the newspaper Daniel had left with the folder, the printed copy of the article published 3 weeks ago in a national outlet, the one that had gone out from her kitchen table at 4 in the morning while she sat across from an old man and didn't interrupt him. She found the section she was looking for on the 3rd page. A list of addresses, properties flagged for forced acquisition under the Challenge Development Plan. 15 addresses in South and Mid-Memphis, all of them now protected, pending the outcome of the legal proceedings the article had set in motion. Her address was the 7th one on the list. She read it twice. Then she set the paper down next to the photograph. She looked at the kitchen around her. The faucet over the sink that had not dripped once since the 3rd morning he was here. The window above it, replaced after the night. A rock came through the old one, the new pane, clean and unscratched in its frame. The photograph of her mother on the table, 22 years younger, standing in a crowd of people, fighting for something. $47,000 in an account with her name on it. The roof over her head, which had nearly not been hers anymore, without her ever knowing it. All of it, every last piece of it, had started with a paper cup of coffee and a sentence she had forgotten before she drove home that night. Marcus was quiet beside her. He looked at the photograph, in the newspaper, in the notebook, and then he looked at his mother, and she could see him assembling something in his mind, the way children assemble things from the pieces available to them, into whatever shape makes the most sense. "Mom," he said, "are we in the news?" She looked at her son, at his face, which held the same directness. It had always held the same uncomplicated willingness to ask the thing straight out that had led him to walk up to a stranger at the kitchen sink and say, "Who are you?" without a moment's hesitation. "No, baby," she said. She looked at the photograph, at her mother's face, at the man with the camera standing beside her, younger by decades, already paying attention. "We're in the story." She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She left Marcus with Gloria on Sunday morning with the kind of casualness that meant she didn't want questions. And Gloria, who had raised 4 children and understood the difference between someone who needed to talk and someone who needed to move, first handed over a plate of biscuits for the boy and didn't ask. Diane drove south. The address had been in the notebook, listed beneath the entry, dated 22 years ago. A street she knew by name, but had never had a specific reason to visit. South Memphis, the older part, where the blocks had been settled long enough that the trees had grown past the rooflines and the buildings wore their age without apology. She found the street without difficulty. She found the building at the end of it just as easily, because it was the kind of structure that had been there long enough to become a landmark, even for people who had never entered it. Low, brick wide. Front steps, a set of double doors that had been repainted enough times over the decades that the current deep green sat on top of everything that had come before it. She parked across the street and sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. This was where her mother had stood. On these steps, or near them, in the early spring of 2001, in a coat Diane had never seen, with her chin up and her shoulders squared in the particular posture of someone who had decided that being seen was necessary, regardless of what it cost. 22 years ago, before Diane had been old enough to understand what that kind of courage required, before she had thought to ask, she reached into her jacket and took out the folded note she had been carrying since the morning she found it on her kitchen table. She unfolded it carefully, the creases soft, from being opened and closed more times than she had counted. The story needed a witness. You were always going to be her. Your mother knew that before either of us did. She stood with it for a while. The December morning was cold and pale, the kind of Sunday that kept most people inside, a man walking a dog at the far end of the block, a car moving slowly through the intersection, the city operating at its weekend pace. The building across the street held its silence, the way old buildings do, like it had absorbed enough of what had happened inside it that the walls had opinions. Pearl had fought for this neighborhood. She had put her name on record when putting your name on record meant accepting whatever came with that. She had spoken to a reporter with a notebook when other people chose to look away and stay quiet. She had done it for streets she walked every day, in schools her daughter attended, and she had never known, as far as Diane could tell, had never known before she passed, whether any of it had mattered in the end. It had mattered. Diane took her phone out of her pocket. Her thumb found the contact before she had made a conscious decision to reach for it. The name was still there the way names stay in a phone long after the person is gone, because removing them feels like a second loss, and there is always a reason to put it off one more day. She pressed call. The line connected for exactly 1 second. Then she remembered. She lowered the phone slowly and held it in both hands and looked at it. That 1 second sat in her chest with a specific, familiar weight, the particular ache of reaching for someone who had been reachable for so long that your hands had not yet learned they weren't anymore. Her mother had been gone for 3 years. She knew that. She just forgot sometimes, in the moments when the thing she needed to say was exactly the kind of thing Pearl Holloway would have known how to receive. She ended the call. She got back in the car and sat with the engine off, and the morning continuing around her. The dog walker returning the other direction. A church bell somewhere several blocks east. The specific quiet of a December Sunday. In a neighborhood that had outlasted things it wasn't supposed to outlast. After a while, she looked up at the building. There was a small mounted panel on the wall beside the double doors. Bronze, colored the kind that gets installed and then becomes part of the background. Noticed mostly by people who are already looking for something. She had not seen it from across the street. She saw it now. She got out and crossed over and walked up to it. The panel read, "In memory of those who stood here." Below the heading, a list of names in small, even lettering. The people who had organized and testified and signed and shown up when showing up was the only thing left to do. 15 names, maybe 20. Her eyes moved down the list, halfway down in the same size. Type, as all the others, no larger, nothing, setting it apart except its place on the wall, Pearl A. Holloway. Diane stood in front of it for a long time. Her mother had known. Somewhere before the end, Pearl had seen her name on this wall and understood that the thing she had given herself to had been recorded, that it had held, that someone had thought it worth preserving in bronze on a brick wall in South Memphis. She had known, and she had never mentioned it to her daughters. Not once. That was so entirely like her that Diane felt something loosen in her chest, not breaking, but releasing, the way a breath releases when you have been holding it longer than you realized. Pearl Holloway had never needed anyone to know what she'd done. She had only needed it to be done. Diane went back to her car. She sat down and let that settle into her. The way true things settle, not quickly, not all at once, but in layers, each one asking for a little more room than the last. She did not rush it. The notebook was on her kitchen table. Marcus was eating biscuits 2 miles north. The story already existed, and she was already in it, and none of that was going anywhere. After a while, she picked up her phone again and called Gloria. Gloria answered on the first ring, which meant she had been keeping the phone close. Diane didn't speak right away. She looked at the building across the street, at the bronze panel beside the green doors, at the name on it. That was also her name, in the way that a mother's name belongs to her children, whether or not anyone ever writes that down. Baby. Gloria's voice was warm and steady. The voice she used when she already understood the shape of something, even before she knew the details. Where are you? Diane looked at the panel one more time. I'm on the street where my mother was brave, she said. A silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone searching for a response, but the silence of someone letting a sentence exist for a moment before answering it. Then Gloria said, "Don't move, I'm coming." 6 months is long enough for Memphis to forget it was ever cold. By May, the city had returned to itself, the particular version of itself that existed only in late spring, before the summer heat settled in and made everything slower and heavier. The nights were warm enough to leave a window open. The trees on her block had filled back in thick and green, and the crickets had come back to the yard with the conviction of something that had never considered leaving. Diane came home from her overnight shift at 2 in the morning and turned onto her street and saw what she always saw now when she turned that corner, the porch light on burning, steady in the dark. She had started leaving it on sometime in the weeks after Joe left, without making a decision about it, exactly the way certain habits establish themselves, not through choice, but through repetition. Until one day, you realize you've been doing something long enough that it's simply become who you are. She told herself it was practical. A light made it easier to find her keys after a long shift. A light meant Marcus could see the porch from the front window if he woke up and needed to know she was home. Those things were true. They were also not the whole truth, and she had stopped pretending otherwise sometime around February. She pulled into the driveway and cut the engine. There was someone on the front steps, a young woman, early 20s, maybe younger. It was hard to tell in the porch light. She was sitting on the top step with her arms wrapped around her knees, wearing a thin, long-sleeved shirt that was not adequate for the hour, even in May, when the warmth of the day had long since left the air. No bag, no phone visible, nothing in her hands. She was looking at the ground in front of her with the concentrated focus of someone who was not actually seeing the ground, but was using it as a place to rest her eyes, while she thought about something else entirely. She did not look up when Diane's headlights swept across the porch. Diane sat in the car. She looked at the young woman on her steps. She looked at the front door behind her, at the warm light coming through the window beside it. She thought about Gloria, standing at her gate, with her arms folded, saying, "You said that Tuesday," with the patience of someone who had watched Diane lie to herself long enough to know exactly what it looked like. She thought about a pair of boot prints pressed into wet soil beneath a child's bedroom window, placed there night after night by a man who understood that some debts get paid forward because there's no other direction to pay them. She thought about a woman in a photograph, standing in a crowd on a street 2 miles south of here, with her chin up and her name signed to things that other people walked past. She got out of the car. Her footsteps on the front walk were quiet on the warm concrete. The young woman heard them anyway and looked up. Her eyes were tired, not sleepy, tired, but the kind of tired that accumulates over days or weeks of not having anywhere to land. There was something else in them too, something that sat just behind the exhaustion and would not let it win entirely. A kind of self-possession, the expression of someone who had decided somewhere, on the way to this porch, that she was not going to ask for anything. Diane stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at this young woman she had never seen before. At the thin shirt and the bare arms, and the careful, contained dignity of someone trying very hard not to appear as depleted as she was. Then she said the only thing that had ever made sense to say. One night, just the couch. The young woman looked at her. A beat passed, one full second of stillness, the kind that happens when someone has been braced for a different kind of answer for so long that the right one takes a moment to register. Then she unfolded herself from the step and stood up slowly. Diane went up the steps and unlocked the door and held it open. They went inside. She stood in the doorway for just a moment before closing it, one hand on the frame, looking back out at the street. The porch light threw a circle of yellow onto the front walk, the same walk she had watched an old man cross in the November rain 7 months ago, the same concrete her mother had probably walked on her way to somewhere important without ever knowing that the somewhere important included this house, this porch, this light. She understood that she was not only opening a door for a tired young woman on a warm May night. She was carrying something forward that had been placed in her hands by people who were no longer here to carry it themselves. That was not a burden. It had never been a burden. It was just the shape of what had been given to her and what she had decided to do with it. She closed the door. She set her keys on the hook by the entrance and turned toward the living room. The bookshelf by the door held the usual things, a few paperbacks, a framed photo of Marcus from last year's school picture, the small everyday objects that accumulate in a home over time. And the notebook, still there, where it had been since Daniel Park placed it on her kitchen table 6 months ago. Cloth cover soft corners, the crease down the spine from years of being opened and held and carried. She rested her hand on the cover for a moment. Just a moment. Then she went to the kitchen to put the coffee on. The young woman was gone by the time the sun came up. Diane knew before she came out of the bedroom. The apartment held the particular quality of a space that had been occupied and then carefully vacated, the same quality she had learned to recognize 7 months ago on an 18th morning in November. She came into the living room and found the couch made, the blanket folded neatly at one end, the pillow centered with its case smoothed flat. On the kitchen table, a piece of paper, torn from somewhere, folded once. "Thank you." 2 words. She stood over it for a moment, then folded it again and held it in her hand. Marcus came out of his room in his pajamas, hair sideways, moving with the unhurried ease of a Saturday morning with nowhere to be. He looked at the couch. He looked at the folded blanket and the centered pillow and the empty space where someone had recently been. He was 9 years old, and he had seen this before, and he understood it the way children understand things that have been allowed to become ordinary. He looked at his mother. "Is that how Mr. Joe came to?" he asked. She looked at her son, at his face, which held the same direct, uncomplicated openness. It had always held the same quality that had led him to walk up to a stranger at the kitchen sink without hesitation and ask, "Who are you?" as if it were the most natural question in the world. "Yeah, baby," she said. "That's exactly how." He nodded once, processing this, and then went to get his sketchbook. She put the mug down and watched him settle onto the living room floor with his pencils spread out in a careful arc in front of him. She put the folded thank you note in the kitchen drawer, in the same spot where Joe's note had lived since November, and went to pour herself a cup from the pot she had made the night before, and reheated now the way mornings went. By the time she came back to the doorway, Marcus had covered most of a page. She stood and watched without interrupting. He was drawing the front of the house, the porch, the oak tree, the front walk, the street. 4 figures stood in the yard: a woman, a boy, a tall, thin man with his hands in his coat pockets, and a 4th person, standing slightly apart, but close enough to belong, a woman, with her hair pulled back in a way that suggested it was naturally full and curly, wearing an apron tied at the waist, one hand raised slightly, as if she had just said something, or was about to. Behind the 4 of them, Marcus had sketched the suggestion of a garden along the back fence. Rough shapes that were clearly meant to be plants climbing in no particular order, growing the way things grow when they have been given good soil and left to decide the rest for themselves. Diane came and crouched beside him. "Who's that?" she asked, meaning the 4th figure. Marcus considered the drawing with the critical eye of someone reviewing their own work. "That's the grandma," he said. "I gave her a garden in the back because Mr. Joe told us about her. He said she cared about things growing." Diane looked at the figure, at the apron, at the raised hand, at the garden behind the fence. She put her hand on her son's shoulder and left it there. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Marcus went back to adding detail to the fence posts, and she stayed beside him for a while, her hand on his shoulder, the morning light coming through the front window at the low warm angle that May mornings in Memphis produced when the weather was finally being generous. That night, after Marcus was in bed and the house had settled into its late quiet, Diane sat down at the kitchen table with the notebook. She had not opened it since the day Daniel Park placed it in front of her. She had read it in the weeks after Joe left, before she knew what she knew now, when reading it was simply the closest she could get to a conversation she hadn't known she needed. But she hadn't opened it since December. It had lived on the shelf by the door, present, available, waiting, with the patience of something that understood it would be reached for when the time was right. She opened it now. She turned to the entry pages, the dated records, the small, careful sentences about small, careful people, and she read through a few of them, the way you read through something familiar, not for new information, but for the quality of the thing itself. Then she turned to the last written page, and then passed it to the first page that was blank. She picked up a pen. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she wrote, "Young woman, front porch, May. No bag, no phone. Eyes tired and proud." Said thank you before she left. She set the pen down. She sat with what she had just done for a moment. It was a small thing, 1 sentence, a few plain facts, nothing that would mean much to anyone who didn't know the context. But she understood now what Joe had understood for 2 years, moving through a world that had given him very little, and choosing anyway to keep a record of what was good in it. He had not done it because he expected the record to matter. He had done it because he believed that kindness deserved to be witnessed, that the small, unremarkable moments when one person saw another and responded to what they saw were worth writing down, worth carrying, worth keeping, even when everything else had to be left behind. Pearl had not known her name would end up on a wall. She had stood up because standing up was what the moment required, and she was the person standing in it. Joe had not known that a cup of coffee and a sentence spoken to a stranger on a cold bench would be the thing that brought him eventually to the door he was looking for. He had written it down anyway, because that was what he did with things that deserved to be remembered. And Diane had not known when she carried that paper cup out the side door of the hospital and set it down beside a man she would forget before she drove home that she was beginning something. She had only known that the man was there, and the coffee was warm, and saying nothing felt like the wrong choice. That was all it had taken. That was all it had ever taken. She closed the notebook and left it on the table. Not on the shelf by the door where it had lived since December. On the table where things go when they are in use, when they are part of the ongoing work of a life, rather than the record of something finished. Outside, the porch light was on. It was on the way. It was on every night now, burning steadily in the warm May dark, not announcing anything, not waiting for anything specific, just present, just visible, just a light in a window that said someone was here, and the door was not the kind that stayed locked. Joe kept a notebook, not because he expected anything in return, but because he believed kindness deserved a witness. Pearl stood up in a crowd because someone had to, and she was there. Diane carried out a cup of coffee because the man on the bench was cold, and saying nothing felt wrong. None of them knew what any of it would become. That is the thing about goodness. It does not require a destination to be worth doing. It only requires a person willing to do it. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone, or made you think of a moment when you chose the open door over the locked one, share it with someone who might need it today. And if you have your own story worth telling, leave it in the comments. We read every one. New stories every week. We'll see you in the next one.